Hey folks, what's going on? Today I'm bringing you a lecture on the basic deadlift mechanics. Now, fair warning, this is attempt number 2 on the first recording of this lecture. Unfortunately, there were some technical difficulties, so I'm recording this once again, and this time should be smooth sailing. Let's preface this by saying the deadlift lecture is not going to be including sumo tips. And the reason for that is that I personally consider sumo to be a bad developmental and strength training exercise.
This upright position with the feet out wide to the side, what does this mirror? That mirrors more of a squatting position. Because you're upright, you're not hinging as much. So by staying upright with your knees out, you're almost like a scissor jack.
So people that hate sumo deadlifts, specifically these Johnny one plate, down bad and muscle mommies, DMs, ass lifters, sumo deadlift is not a lesser feat of strength than conventional deadlift.
Why do people consider sumo deadlift cheating? And do you? Well, they consider it cheating because it is cheating.
Now, when people say sumo is cheating, I don't think they mean it's literally cheating. Maybe a few people do.
I don't necessarily think that sumo is cheating, however, although there are probably some people who, with their build and flexibility and leverages, are able to use sumo greatly to their individual advantage. And what you'll see in powerlifting is probably that at the highest level, there will be certain records that will probably largely only be held by people who pull sumo, but that's not to say 100% of everyone is stronger in that stance. Now again, my criticism doesn't come from whether or not it gives people an advantage in competition. I'm not a powerlifter. My critique for sumo is that it's a worse developmental exercise, and in fact, it is not a true hip hinge. It's more or less a modified version of a squat, if you will. It's not great. You don't get the same back development and hamstring development that you do out of a conventional deadlift, and it works a lot more quads and a lot more adductors, especially depending on how wide your stance is. So when I say deadlift, I mean conventional deadlift. And it's sad that it's even earned the name conventional deadlift when I think it should just be called a deadlift, because that's what it is. So let's get right into it. We're going to cover today the muscles that are used, stance, and setting up. We're going to go over leverages, what differentiates the deadlift movement pattern as a hip hinge from the squat movement pattern. We're going to talk about fixing technique, and then once you've done that, addressing some weak points with some excellent variations. And then we'll be moving on to just an overall checklist for accessories and secondaries to help you push lots of volume without necessarily putting a ton of stress on your joints. And finally, I'll be giving you guys a brief guide on how to do your strength work when it comes to deadlift training. All right, without further ado, so for the muscles, typically what you're going to see the most growth and development from when it comes to the deadlift is in your spinal erectors, your hamstrings, and your glutes. So this is a true posterior chain exercises. That means it's predominantly working muscles on the back of your body. Even though the quads play an important role on the deadlift when it comes to leg drive and getting the bar the first few inches off of the floor, what you're going to see is that deadlift alone is not really sufficient to make a dramatic change in the way your quads look, or let's say your ability to squat. However, in reverse, the same is not true, and so blowing up your squat is one of the best ways to ensure that you have a strong deadlift and that you keep getting stronger at similar rates and you flesh out your gains and that you don't hit a stall, because if you do not train a squat, you might find there's a point where the limiting factor is absolutely a lack of leg drive. And that happens to a lot of dudes who are taller, lankier, you're built for the deadlift, or you just you start training the deadlift and you realize how strong you are on that one particular exercise compared to like your squat or your bench press or overhead press. And because you realize you're so strong on that movement that you kind of sandbag everything else so you can focus on your deadlift. Well, if that's the case, eventually you will hit a wall because your quads aren't strong enough to get past that first couple inches of the movement. So it's important not only that we develop the posterior chain, and it's not only relevant that we are developing that on the deadlift, we are going to need other muscles such as our quads, our lats, our grip, and our traps to do some of that work, right? So the lats are going to make sure that the bar stays relatively close to our legs. It's okay if it shifts a little bit. People will tell you to keep the bar really tight to your legs. In fact, some people will give you the cue, make your shins bleed, and you should be wearing shin guards because that's how much you're rubbing that bar against your legs.
Nothing says badass like a pair of bloody shins. Beast mode. If my shins are bleeding when I'm deadlifting, I must be doing something right.
I don't think that's necessary. I think it's good to make contact with your shins, but by no means do you have to lose skin to have effective deadlift training. Let's think for just a moment, shall we? What is a stiff leg deadlift? Well, it's pretty much a deadlift where you start with your hips in a higher position and the bar away from your shins. There's less knee flexion in the starting position, and it's more hamstring, glute, and back dominant than the conventional deadlift. Okay, and what is a common critique of people's deadlift form? They're not sitting low enough. You're basically doing a stiff leg deadlift. So if a stiff leg deadlift is a suitable variation for strengthening your posterior chain, if a common criticism is that someone's doing the stiff leg deadlift when they shouldn't be, then why would it be dangerous just to let the bar a little bit away from your shins? If someone ever tries to tell you it's dangerous for the bar not to completely make contact and scrape your shins, they're wrong, because there are many deadlift variations where the bar doesn't make contact with your shins. It's okay. But for the sake of this particular movement, yes, you want them to be very close to your shins, and in fact, riding them up until you get them past your knees. Grip is important, and when it comes to grip, feel free to use straps as early as possible in your deadlift training. I don't believe the notion that you have to be limited by your grip, and in fact, you can use a mixed grip or a hook grip or a strap, and they're all perfectly reasonable ways to ensure that your grip doesn't hold you back in your deadlift training, because you're stronger than you think if you're letting your grip be the sign that, oh, I've hit a plateau. Well, if you just include a mixed grip or straps or hook grip, if you can tolerate it / get used to it, then you're going to be a lot stronger long term than if you just get stuck with your grip. As far as the stance goes, okay, we want our weight to be on our heels on this movement. We want our shins to be touching the bar in the start position. We want the knees to be pushing outward into our forearms. And as far as like stance goes for grip width, feet width, that sort of thing, I think it really should be customized and individualized. Although typically what you'll find is that hip width feels pretty good as far as the stance goes. And with the grip width, you want your arms to be mostly vertical, although maybe slightly outside of that. That will typically feel pretty good. And again, if you're pushing hard with your knees into your forearms, it's going to create a more rigid unit. Your kinetic chain is going to bleed less energy as you're doing your pull. Keeping the weight on the heels is important, because if we're not sitting back as much as possible on the deadlift, we're going to lose power, and we're going to look more like a stiff leg deadlift if we're not sitting low enough. Yes, it's true you can sit too low on the deadlift and then it becomes like squatting the weight, but we want to be just shy of that. We want to be, okay, so this is too low, well then let's come up a little bit. Oh, that's a sweet spot, that feels good, perfect. So somewhere between a stiff leg deadlift and squatting the deadlift, that's a sweet spot. And again, this really should be customized. No two people will deadlift the exact same way. Some people have their feet flared out, some people are perfectly pointing forward. It's up to you, find what feels good. Okay, now let's discuss the hip hinging itself and why this is such a good exercise, even if you're not a power lifter, which again, I'm not. So I would consider this overall the #1 hypertrophy exercise and strength developing exercise in the body. If there was one barbell exercise of all the major exercises that someone could do for the rest of their life just to maintain some strength and health and muscle mass, this would be it. This would be it. This works probably more muscles than any other exercise, period. And the way that it hits those muscles is enough to grow and maintain enough strength to do really any daily activity or chore that a person could be required to do in the span of a week. So for elderly people out there, for people who've had injuries, whether that's herniated discs, things like that, you'd be surprised how well tolerated the deadlift is if you start small and reasonable and just build them up slowly over time. Again, stronger glutes, stronger hamstrings, right? Hamstrings are the muscle that's working the most on walking. So we all spend plenty of time walking, right, throughout the week. This is such a great exercise because it's working big muscles that we need in our everyday life. So again, if you're not competitive, this is still going to put muscle on faster than any other exercise because it's working so many muscles and so many big muscles. It's such an efficient way to get big and strong at the same time. And prior to powerlifting, which again became popular in the 1960s, this exercise was really just treated from a general development standpoint. Okay, so this is great for athletes, whether that means you're like a sprinter, whether that means you're playing football, whether you're a fighter, okay? Or again, if you're just an elderly person or you're just an average Joe and you want to be healthy, please do some deadlifts. Don't just do lower back stretching to make your back pain go away. That stuff's really overrated. Stretching can help a little bit, but without the combination of resistance training, it's merely a band-aid rather than a helpful tool to make long-term progress. Okay, from a mechanics standpoint, what you see on the deadlift is a hip change in angle. There's an angle change that is so large that it makes it obvious to the naked eye that is the joint where the largest angle change is occurring, whereas with the squat, it's usually the knee. The knee is the hip is seeing a lot of movement as well, but it's predominantly a knee movement. Even though our hip extensors are working and squats are a great way to get big, strong glutes, it's predominantly a quad exercise, whether you're doing low bar, high bar, front squat, etc. So that's what we need to see on our deadlift. Otherwise, yes, if you start hips too low, this might be exaggerated. This is someone looking more like me where they're able to get their shins pretty much vertical on their deadlift and their butt really nice and low, and then they can just hip hinge it up from there. For someone else, that might be more like squatting their deadlift, and if your hips and knees are at the same height, you're squatting your deadlift, okay? They need to be above your knees, but not necessarily by a ton, especially depending on how you're built. So as far as like bar placement over the foot, you'll hear some people religiously say, bar over the midfoot, bar over the midfoot. I think that's great advice for something like RDLs or stiff leg deadlifts, but for the conventional deadlift, I think that people's limb length ratios and sometimes their arms and torsos are longer or shorter. It's just going to lead to too many different variations where some people will benefit from midfoot. And for me personally, I have the bar behind my midfoot when I set up on the deadlift. That feels really good. That allows me to get my hips low and tight to the bar where I feel really strong and powerful in that position. And if I try and get the bar over the midfoot, well, then that's closer to being a stiff leg deadlift for me. It might not be that case for everyone else. But in general, having the bar behind your midfoot is probably ideal. Okay, so that's really what differentiates the squat and the knees. It's that at the hips, you see this folding at the waist. That's the movement. That's the movement. It's not knees driving the movement, it's hips. As far as leverages go, good leverages, what people would typically call good leverages, is someone who's able to be more upright with their torso in the starting position. Someone who has bad leverages is going to be more horizontal, which looks very similar to this down here. That's a stiff leg deadlift, right? Basically, the person who has bad leverages, even though they're at a disadvantage, maybe from a competitive standpoint, because they're not going to be as strong on the same movement with the same bar height and so on, they're going to get a ton of hypertrophy out of like building a 500-pound deadlift. The way I would phrase it like this is the person with really good leverages will have built less muscle by the time they get to 500 on the deadlift than the person who has worse leverages. It might take the person who has worse leverages a little bit longer, and it might be more of a struggle to get there. But by the time they get there, they'll probably have put on more muscle to compensate for the fact that they have bad leverages. So what is when something is a competitive disadvantage when it comes to strength, sometimes that's a hypertrophy training advantage. They can get more at a less weight because they have bad leverages.
More out of less weight. More out of less weight.
And that's what so many variations are with strength training, whether that's the bench, squat, deadlift. It's a self-limiting variation that allows you to target whether that's more chest, more quad, more glutes, more hamstrings with less weight, which is easier on your joints. Ta-da! If you've got bad leverages, you're already doing a self-limiting variation. So don't use leverages as an excuse not to do bench, not to do squat, not to do deadlifts. You have so much to gain from all of these exercises, regardless of how you're built. Okay, now technique is important to talk about before we get into weak points and certain accessories that can address your weak points as you continue to train the deadlift, especially beyond the beginner phase. If someone has an inefficient pull, whether that be because they're just sitting their hips too low or they're getting the bar too far forward on their foot, right? They're obsessively doing that mid-foot position. Or if someone's hyper extending in their lower back, or they're allowing themselves to be in a mechanically inefficient position, right? If you have a sloppy pull, if you're not being efficient on the pull, what's going to happen is that you're going to struggle more getting to lockout than someone else. So sometimes a crummy lockout is the result of a bad setup and a bad pull from a technical standpoint, rather than, oh, they have a weak back and weak glutes, and that's why they didn't lock it out as nicely as someone else.
I think most lockout issues tend to stem from poor positioning off the floor.
If they do have a good setup, then what you'll see is that for people who do, generally speaking, shake a lot and struggle going to lockout, what you'll see is that they can benefit a ton from back, glute, hamstring strengthening if lockout's more the concern, and if leg drag's more the concern, then something like doing more squats, doing hack deadlifts, doing front squats. Those are going to be excellent ways to increase their leg drive because they're biasing the quads in those variations of the big three. So for someone who wants bigger glutes and hamstrings, stiff leg deadlifts and Romanian deadlifts are like the king of posterior chain hypertrophy from a self-limiting standpoint. They allow you to use probably double-digit percentage less weight, and they're very, very easy to set up. So regardless of your flexibility on the stiff leg and Romanian deadlift, you can just bend your knees more or less in a way that's catered to your individual flexibility. Some people get really uptight about how much you're allowed to bend your knees on these variations of the hip hinge. But you know what? I bend my knees a lot when I do Romanian deadlifts, and I still get a ton of hamstring work. And I think the reason for that is very simple. If I was more flexible, the same position I do now would give me less stimulus because there would be less stretch. And so I would have to bend my knees less in order to get that stretch and work my hamstrings the same amount I am now. Now, were I to be even less flexible, I would have to bend my knees more just to be able to get into a proper position where I have control over the weight to an equal depth or equal change in my hip flexion. Basically, what I'm saying is this. It's okay if your Romanian deadlift looks different from mine or looks different from Jeff Nippard's or Bald Omni-Man's or whoever's. We don't all have to do exercise technique the same. One that's really great specifically for the back, although it certainly works your glutes and stuff too, back extension variations with weight, whether that's with the 45-degree incline bench for doing back extensions, or whether that's with the glute ham developer, glute ham raise. Okay, and holding a barbell is a great way to do this. You can do this with a weighted vest as well. You can do this with like kettlebells or something if you really wanted to. And then as far as high specificity variations go, you can keep it really simple and do things like eccentric and pause deadlifts. So the muscles used are going to be pretty much identical on these ones. Okay, so on a pause variation, you get the weight off the floor and you're maybe a couple inches off the floor and then you hold it for a second or two and then you continue the pull and you go all the way to lockout. On the eccentric one, it's literally just a deadlift, but you do the work on the way down. So it's typical to see people drop the weight or drop the weight past their knees, things like that, to reduce the amount of eccentric work to not beat up their muscles as much and not beat up their joints as much. But if you're using a little bit lighter of a weight, you can get away with eccentric deadlifts, and it will really build a strong, jacked lower back, so will paused variations. So these are kind of like a simple foolproof version of this, although not necessarily the same, because here you still have to do leg drive and there's more hamstring work and so on. But especially for people who are working out at home, I would suggest consider using in all of your deadlift sessions at least a little bit of pause deadlifts or eccentric deadlifts, just to make sure that you have a really jacked back as you're training. So even if you don't have access to any of these types of machines or anything like that, you're going to get a lot out of your barbell training just with a simple modulation change to the time under tension. We're increasing time under tension in both the pause and eccentric deadlift. For the hack deadlift, we're building more yoke. So we got more trap activation, more lat activation. This is such a great way to develop your upper back. It's right in the same category as doing front squats. It's also more quad dominant. As you can see here, this gentleman has hit the bar behind his legs and his chest is more upright, which is a very, very similar position to a front squat. So that's really it. It's literally just a deadlift, but it's behind you, and therefore it's more upper back and quad focused. Such a great way to improve leg drive, especially for someone like me. That's currently my weak point. From doing exactly what I described earlier, there's a period of time, at least 6 months, where my deadlift training was much more significant than my quad training, and I paid for it in the long run. But at the same time, I'm having a lot of fun training the squat now, more than my deadlift. So it evens out, right? You can't cheat work. You can't work the deadlift twice as hard and work the squat not at all, and then not work your deadlift and then work the squat twice as hard as you did the deadlift and somehow end up with like bigger numbers. Basically, what I'm trying to say is there's a limited amount of work you can do in 6 months or a year. Okay, it's not like if you sandbag one exercise to blow up the other one, you can make both even stronger by then doing the opposite of that. There's really a limited amount of potential that you can achieve over a course of time. So don't try and cheat work. All right, as far as secondaries and accessories go, stiff leg deadlifts, Romanian deadlifts are very, very high in their specificity, and that's what these first several ones here are. They're really, again, I said it, they're the king of posterior chain hypertrophy exercises that are specific to the deadlift. Paused and eccentric are a foolproof way to get a jacked back by increasing the time under tension. Hack deadlifts are really, really good for improving your leg drive without necessarily including something like a front squat. They allow you to it's still a hip hinge, but they're going to be a little bit more gentle on your lower back, which is really nice. We already talked about the back extension variations here, and then there's a camber and a block pull, which basically just increases the bar height. So in both of those variations, someone with bad leverages is going to be quite a bit stronger from a camber bar or block pull, and someone with good leverages is still going to be a decent amount stronger with those. That's going to allow you to push some heavier weights, especially they can help eliminate the phase of the movement where you need a ton of leg drive. So as far as just playing around with heavier weights and getting used to them, it's a good way to amp yourself up for a heavy weight. Let's say in the next 2 or 3 months, you're hoping to hit 4 or 5 or 5 plates on the deadlift. Well, what you could do is get to the point where you could do a 5-plate camber bar pull or block pull, and then just work your way up with the regular deadlift, and then you'll know sort of as a litmus test what that weight feels like. You'll know that you can lock that weight out, and now you just need to make sure you keep training normally and your leg drive especially, and within a matter of months, you'll be there on the normal deadlift variation. I wouldn't necessarily say it's like the greatest variation, but these are certainly acceptable, and if you truly have terrible deadlift leverages, honestly, it might make a good main variation. As far as low specificity movements go, hamstring curls, cobras, leg extensions, and hip thrusts are a great way to accumulate volume without doing a compound movement that's hard on the joints like deadlifts, and their variations somewhat are. Okay, so you're going to get a lot of good hamstring volume out of this, good quad volume out of this, good back volume out of this, and good glute volume out of this. Not all of them are necessary, and I would say that a good deadlift program looks something like this. You do deadlifts, whether that's 5, 6, 8, 10 sets a week. You're doing the deadlift, not sumo, the deadlift, the conventional deadlift. Then on top of that, maybe you splash on a little bit of work wherever you feel the weakest. Again, as long as you make sure you have good technique first. So that could be like a couple sets a week, or one set at the end of each session for something like a hack deadlift, a paused eccentric deadlift, some back extensions, and then splash in a few sets per session. If you're training once, twice, 3 times a week, splash in a couple sets of one of these, not all of them. Pick one. Pick your weakest area and stick to it. For me, it would be leg extensions or an equivalent, wall sits or something like that, okay, to blow up the quads. Don't do all of these and all of these in the same block of training, okay? Pick a couple exercises for each movement pattern for a period of several months and then swap them out for variations. Don't try and bite off more than you can chew by doing like 6 different types of deadlifts within the span of every 2 weeks and you just stick to that for 6 months. It's getting a little bit out of hand at that point. Now, onto the quick guide for strength work. Be super content with small progressions on the deadlift. Adding 5 pounds to your deadlift is actually super meaningful, okay? If you think that's too small, well, sure, maybe you're a beginner and you've been able to consistently add 10 pounds a week or 10, 15 pounds every month. Those gains are going to dry up, okay? You're going to get to the point where 5 pounds a month is plenty of progress, or at least 5 pounds a week. So don't be in a hurry to just speed run through everything in your training. Be content with small progressions. If you're going to attempt a PR, you want to secure that first PR. Let's say you were doing 350, and then next week you do 355, or 2 or 3 weeks later you do 355. Well, if you successfully pull that, don't just immediately try 360, save it for next time, and then what will happen is you'll be consistently smashing PRs, whether that's like at a RP 7 or 8, something, you know, nice and reasonable. Basically, something that you can almost pull for a double because it just feels so smooth. Why not just keep doing that, then use up all your resources? Okay, secure the PR, be content with small progress. And as far as increasing your working sets, I mean, if you increase your working sets by like 15, 20 pounds in a month, that's plenty. You don't need to add 30 pounds a month to your working sets of 5 or working sets of 10. Okay, don't get crazy. Be content with small progress. 5 to 10 rep range is probably ideal, and then feel free to splash in a few singles or doubles throughout the week, maybe in one of your sessions. If you do 2 sessions of deadlifts in a week, maybe have one session where you do a single and a double and a set of 5, and then maybe in your other session you could do 2 sets of 10, 2 sets of 5, after all of your warm-ups, of course. Or feel free to keep your periodization even more simple, okay, like someone like I do, super caveman, and just do consistently whatever feels like a sweet spot for you. So if like 8 to 10 feels like a sweet spot, stay there and do that 2 sessions a week, or do like 5 to 7 if that feels more like a sweet spot. All of this has to be submaximal. You probably shouldn't go to failure on deadlifts all the time. I can't guarantee that it'll hurt you or that it'll make you be demoralized, but you know what, you're gonna feel a lot better if you give yourself a rep or 2 in reserve on the deadlift. So RPE 7 at 9 is perfectly fine, and 5 to 12 sets per week, I think that's plenty. Okay, 5 sets a week, if you're training deadlift like once a week, that's enough to give you a jacked back posterior chain. If you want to do it a couple times a week, maybe 8 sets a week, maybe 10. Someone training, you know, full body 3 times a week. If your RPE is low enough, I suppose even 12 sets a week would feel good, but there's no need to do 20 sets of deadlifts a week or deadlift 5 times a week. That's just not necessary. Okay, and this is the last point. When it comes to warming up, yes, you should do multiple warm-up sets, but I would advise that one of them is specifically focused on blood flow more than technique. So that could be something like doing Romanian deadlifts here, where we've got the torso angle that's closer to being parallel with the floor. That's more specific to your posterior chain. So since your back and hips are more the problematic area, they get beat up more on the deadlift than like your knees would. Let's do a set of that first before we do a warm-up set or 2 of the conventional deadlift, so that way we just rush more blood into the back, into the hips before we move on to the working sets. And then what I would call the specific warm-up would be a technical warm-up where, yeah, if you do an actual set of the movement, whether that's bench before bench, squat before squat, deadlift before deadlift, the technique of your warm-up should very much, 99% match your technique on your hard-working sets. And that's really it, guys. I don't want you to overthink your deadlift training. I just want you to know this. If your deadlift progress is stalling, there's a way forward, and chances are you just need to be patient and diligent with your deadlift. If you're someone who's had back injuries or hip injuries in the past and you've been told that weight training is bad for you, or some medical professional or your friend or your mom tried to talk you into lifting heavy weights, guess what? It's one of the most proven, tried and true ways to make serious pain and mobility improvements over time, whether that's fractures, disc herniations, osteoporosis, arthritis, you name it. And this isn't medical advice, but guess what? If you move less, you're gonna suck more at moving. If you move more, you're gonna be better at moving. And if you do some of these key fundamental movements like the deadlift with heavy weights, slowly, gradually building up over time, taking your time with technique, doing your warm-ups, you're gonna be just fine. And you're probably gonna feel a lot better within 3 to 6 months, and you'll be glad that you started. So if you've never done a deadlift before in your life, it's a much less intimidating and scary experience than it might look like. I was intimidated a lot by it when I was in high school, and I never did it. And it wasn't until I was in college that I ever really first did a true, proper, conventional deadlift. Okay, so give them a try if you're an absolute beginner. If you're someone who's closer to intermediate, like you're able to deadlift in the 300s or the 400s, and you're worried that your progress is stalling, you can address those weak points, okay? Especially focus on your leg drive and getting a jacked back. At the end of the day, your technique has to be decent and reliable, consistent, repeatable, but more importantly, it's individualized to you. So don't obsess over making your technique look like someone else's unless they can explain why that is that theirs is more efficient, okay? Feel free to experiment with things like how many sets you do per week and how many reps you do in your sets. It's none of my business telling you how many reps to do on the deadlift. If you're doing 5 to 12 reps, or 5 to 10 reps, excuse me, you're gonna build plenty of muscle, you're gonna get plenty strong. Okay, that's it. Just keep it simple, folks. This is such a good exercise. It really should be a big part of your training and a big part of your time spent in the gym. So give the deadlift a lot of love, tender care, and focus, and it will reward you and pay off in the end. But that's it. That's all I've got for you. So I'll see you guys in the next one. Thanks for joining me.